This conference will now be recorded.
Founding partner of Foresight Law and Policy. I'm joined today by Foresight's other founding partner, Reg Lichty, our partner Elliot Regenstein, and Tom Gentzel, principal of Gentzel Insights, LLC. Many of you know Tom as the former executive director of the National School Boards Association, and before that of the Pennsylvania School Boards Association. Tom is the lead author of a new paper our two organizations just released. It's designed to prompt reflection and conversation about how school boards can become more agile, better engage with their communities, and achieve more equitable outcomes for students. In other words, innovating and leading through current disruptions and over the long term. For many local board members, virtually every moment of 2020 has been an exercise in innovation. Responsibilities have been enormous, scrutiny has been sharp, and there's been little margin for error, or at least I know it must have felt that way for many of you. As the authors of the paper noted, and will highlight today, a rule-bound mentality is a poor fit for times that require innovation and creativity. But often the changes that are needed don't require working around the rules or even trying to work within them. Things like mentality and the history of practice often present the most significant obstacles to innovation and creativity, when what is often needed are new approaches to the duties that have been delegated to school board members over the past century or more. Before I hand you off to my colleagues to present some of the information shared in the report, I do want to note that we'll have approximately 15 minutes, perhaps a little more at the end of this session for question and answer. A few of you have already submitted questions in advance, and we appreciate that. If you or others have additional questions that come to mind during the presentation, please type them into the chat box and I'll facilitate a question and answer session at the end of this hour. Please also note, you probably just heard this session is being recorded. Both the recording and the paper will be available through a link we'll share with all participants tomorrow and available on the Foresight Law and Policy website. Let me hand you now to Tom Gentzel.
Thank you, Amy, and welcome everybody. I know that some of my former colleagues around the country are online, and I appreciate that, and we welcome all of you. And I want to say a special thank you to Foresight, which is just an incredible firm in DC. It does a lot of really great education policy work and supporting school leaders at the state and local level. And I was genuinely honored to be invited to work with them on this project. I've spent 40 years working with school boards. And somewhere along the line, I really came to appreciate just how important they are in a way that perhaps a lot of people don't think about. And that is their role in really reflecting community ownership of public schools. American public education is quite different than other countries. We're not just, an outpost of a larger federal agency. We're really a community organization, and that leadership by school boards is critically important to that. And certainly the pandemic, the time that we're in right now, I think it reflects the need for effective local leadership. So if we can go to the next slide, we'll just talk a little bit about why boards are important and what that really means, especially in this time of crisis, because I think now is when people look to local leaders to stand up and really deliver. And it's important because we have a history of school boards being really engines driving this education system. Next slide. We'll talk a little bit about why we're here. And of course, it's the pandemic that really creates this opportunity for a conversation. Life changed dramatically earlier this year, and school districts recognized immediately there were some incredible headwinds and challenges that they faced. One of them, of course, was that a lot of students in this country don't have internet in their homes. And in fact, this disproportionately affects students of color and those in low-income families. But we also had teachers that frankly weren't prepared to deliver instruction remotely. That's a whole different way of teaching that a lot of them weren't prepared for. And again, as we note in the paper, quite a few of them don't have the devices or the technology at home to really support that kind of learning either. But as Amy mentioned just a moment ago, public education is a highly regulated industry. And that runs into direct conflict when you need to be agile and move quickly and try new things. And that becomes a real challenge. So when we're moving to remote learning, for example, and we have these issues I just described, lack of technology, uh, and you have state regulations and other requirements that you're trying to comply with, it creates some enormous challenges. And then to that, we add the fact that school districts, school officials often were receiving conflicting advice from state and federal leaders around health and safety measures they should be taking as they were working really hard to keep everybody safe, including, we would note, a lot of folks who work in the school system who have their own health issues, who were legitimately very concerned about contracting the coronavirus. So through all of that, through all of it, I think public school officials generally were credited with doing a good job in the spring of kind of doing the best that they could and without any notice to get through the end of the school year. And I think that's to their great credit. We can be really proud of that. But the reality is we meet here at the end of October is that's a long time ago already. And so the surprise that we had in the spring is over and we're in a new place. Next slide, please. So we want to talk a little bit about what that means. And again, as Amy said up front, I think the centerpiece of this paper and this work that we're doing is around agile leadership. And it's really called for now. And it's difficult because we have been working in a system, as I said, that's highly regulated. There are compliance requirements that tend to drive the system. And so we've given some thought to what steps districts could take to try to be more agile. And I want to be clear that this isn't a prescription. These are ideas that we're sharing, things you may want to think about. First of all, it's important to identify the barriers that you're running into in that compliance-driven system, reporting requirements, other deadlines that you need to meet that just may be pretty irrelevant right now as you're trying to redesign this whole delivery system. Identify them and then try to determine if any of them can be waived or altered. What kind of relief are you able to get? I can tell you in my career, on more than one occasion, I ran into local school officials who were convinced that they couldn't do something because the state mandated it. And we pointed out to them that wasn't true. The state had a guideline, some recommendations. It wasn't a requirement. So you really need to understand what the rules are and whether you have some flexibility. I think it's also important to look at internal operations. Your policies and the procedures that your board and your superintendent have in place may actually be creating some barriers for your teachers and the staff in the school system that might be worth revisiting as well. There's a lot of muscle memory, I would call it, that goes into school leadership. It's not a bad thing. It means people kind of have their arms around what they need to do and they know when they need to do it. But at a time like this, it's really worth revisiting some of those things. And I'll give you an example. I know, again, from my experience, a lot of school board agendas kind of follow a pattern. There are certain things that will be on the November school board agenda because these are things that have to be taken care of in November. And I'm not saying that they can all be waived or you can just forget about them, but perhaps some of them don't actually require as much time on of the board's discussion. Perhaps there are other ways to address them. So again, just taking a hard look at what you're doing and how you're doing it at a time like this really can make a big difference. Ask yourself the question, do you have the data, the information that you need as a board, as a leadership team, in order to make these decisions? And if not, how can you get that information? And what feedback are you getting from people in the school system, the community, certainly parents, teachers, students, that could help inform that evaluation? We're also suggesting it's worth taking a little time. This is difficult, but it's taking a little time right now to evaluate yourselves as a school leadership team. Um, Now, in the midst of a crisis, it's hard to set aside time for this kind of reflection, but we think it could be really important. What decisions have you made since March when all of this happened? What's worked well? What hasn't? What have you learned from it? And how can that inform the decisions that you need to be making going forward? Because ultimately, you're learning as you go. And that relates really to a final point, which is my favorite question of all time, which is always, so what? I mean, so what have you learned? What difference does all of this make? And how is it going to alter the work that you do going forward? And so when you're sharing these experiences and these learnings, it's not just within the school system, but we think it's important to share with other districts that are going through the same kinds of challenges. Districts in your county and your immediate area, perhaps in other places in the state or the country. And this is a shameless plug for my former colleagues, but you need to share these experiences with your state associations. I can tell you, as a former state and national exec for school boards, getting that kind of feedback from local school officials about what we could do to help them in terms of advocating for changes in state or national policies was critically important. And finally, I just want to point out that at some point in the future, we're going to be audited. You're going to be audited about how you spent money and the decisions you made. The more you can document why you're making some of these decisions now in real time, I think the better that will serve you later. So let's move to the next slide. I want to talk a little bit about, I think, sort of the centerpiece, the linchpin in some ways of the work that school boards do, and that is how you communicate and keep the community informed. Next slide. So one day, I don't know when it happened, I had what I called my blinding glimpse of the obvious. And I'm ashamed to say this didn't occur to me early on in my school board career, but it did occur to me at some point that every state in the United States has school boards. Now, there's an asterisk. Hawaii has one board for the entire state. Everybody wants to go to Hawaii to study that model. But the reality is every other state has school boards, school committees, they're called different things. And so the question comes up, why did that happen? And there are probably a lot of reasons, but I think one of them is that we came to the states, various states, came to the conclusion that if this public education system was going to work, it had to have the effective local leadership. And that's what school boards, I think, really represent. But here's what's fascinating, at least to me, and that is there's inherent conflict built into this system, right? I mean, you have state requirements, uniformity. You want to make sure that all students have access to a free education, a minimum school year, and that comes into direct conflict sometimes with the need for local flexibility and meeting the needs at the local level. I'd rather call it creative tension because I think out of this tension between state regulation and uniformity and local creativity and flexibility has come some really dynamic changes over the years that has helped public education remain relevant and serve students really, really well. But again, the key to that is that school boards are in contact and remaining really open and transparent with their communities. So here's at least a premise I want to share, which I think is critical to this work, and that is there is no general public. If we think about a general public, then we fall into a trap sometimes where if we just put the information out there, throw it up against the wall, it's going to stick. People will hear about it eventually. And I think we need to think about publics, plural, because there are groups and there are interests within your community, and they need to be identified and communicated with. Now, you have formal communications, newsletters, websites, public meetings, all of that's important. But I think the informal is actually even more important because it allows us to identify those target audiences, those people, and to reach them. So I'll tell you a very quick little war story. Years ago, I was at a barber's, and please don't laugh. I'd still go to a barber. I pay the same amount, by the way, as people with a full head of hair, but that's another matter. We'll get into that later. I'm at this barber shop, and I really like this guy. Unfortunately, he had to close his business due to health reasons. But you know, he was an interesting guy. And one Saturday I was in there, and it really hit me. I mean, I'm watching parents with their little kids in tow, and you know, blue collar workers, professional types. Everybody came in, and they all liked Merle, the barber, and they all talked to him. They were comfortable with him. Folks, you all know Merle. So everybody in community, school board members, others, you know people like Merle who are connected across social strata. They have credibility in the community, and they can provide great feedback about how you're doing as a district, and they can be a great conduit to get your information out to other people. And so that's just one example of how this kind of messaging can really be drawn down to a level that can really make a difference. Can we turn to the next slide, please? I'll close my section with a little discussion about how all this can come together. And again, this is just one idea, one model. There are probably plenty of others that could be based on the same premise. But first of all, it's important to have a plan, regardless of what the issue is. Right now, we're talking about starting school, how we deliver education remotely, how much we bring students into school. But just having a plan is really important if it's based on the kind of evaluation and feedback that hopefully you're getting through all these conversations with the community. Plans, though, and decisions by school boards need to be explained. You know, our government is a representative democracy. We all know that. We elect people to make decisions on our behalf. But we assume, I think baked into the system, is that these public officials are going to keep us informed. We're going to know why they made the decisions they made. So this becomes really important when we're talking about schools, and especially important, I think, at a time like this, when there's a lot of concern and questions about what districts are doing and why they're doing it. So I would argue boards need to not only make these decisions, but explain the options that were considered, the ones that were rejected, and why. And as part of that whole process, to engage allies, people who have shared interest in the work of the school system. My guess is that most districts around this country are working pretty closely right now with health agencies and family and youth organizations, some of which they probably had close connections with before, many of which they may not have. But these organizations and these interests need to be allied with your work. They need to have ownership too. They need to see their fingerprints on the work that the district's doing so they can advocate for it as well. And parenthetically, I would just point out, having spent a lot of time in a lot of districts, organizations like this, nonprofits that might be supporting the work of the district, the people in those organizations, the staff, the board members, others, they're probably in your district too. They may have kids in your school system. So you can expand your own network of communication that way as well. And then two other quick points, and then I'll close out. One is critically important, I think, for everybody in the school system. And I'm talking school board members, administrators, teachers, bus drivers, cafeteria workers, everybody, to have key talking points about what the district's doing. You know, you can spend months and months planning, but the critical test becomes the dairy aisle in the grocery store when somebody stops somebody in your district and said, what's the district doing on fill in the blank? And if the answer is, I don't know, your credibility just took a shot. And this can be easily addressed by engaging the people in your system. And then finally, plans are, I think, need to be revisited regularly, and especially now. Think how much more we know now about the pandemic, the spread of the virus, than we did a few months ago, and how much more things are likely to change in the next few months. So letting people know up front, this is our plan, but we're going to be revisiting it regularly, I think helps people remain engaged with the work of the district. So I'll stop there. I look forward to our conversation. Amy?
Great. Thank you, Tom. Just a reminder, if you've got questions that you'd like for Tom or others on the panel to address, please type them into the chat function on the webinar. Before we go, though, on to our next presenter, I'd like to ask a question to you, Tom. The paper that our organizations have put out focuses largely on opportunities for local boards. But I know from you that you have really strong beliefs that strong boards work hand in hand with strong superintendents, right? It doesn't all fall on the shoulders of boards. Any other thoughts you'd like to share before we go on about, how you could highlight the work of leadership teams?
Yeah, thank you, Amy. I think I'd make a couple quick comments here. One is every effective district that I've seen has a good working relationship between the board and the superintendent. And by the way, that doesn't mean they all agree all the time on everything. In fact, I often tell boards, if you're always unanimous on everything, somebody's probably not thinking. It's okay to have some disagreement, but I'm talking about pulling in the same direction, having the same, strategic intent about where you want the district to go. The board should never be involved in the day-to-day operations of a district. But I can tell you, going back 40 years ago when I started working with school boards, we would do school board training, and we talked about the 4 Bs: buildings, buses, budgets, and ball games. That was the key piece. The board's role was to put the resources in place, and it was up to the administration to make sure the kids were being educated. Well, I think we've learned through the Lighthouse study and through a lot of research and experience, if boards don't feel some sense of ownership for how students are learning, and they don't organize their meetings and their conversations around that, we're missing a huge opportunity. And that should be the centerpiece, I think, of a strong school board superintendent team.
Great. Thank you, Tom. I'll now hand over to Elliot Regenstein to talk some about the ensuring equity. Elliot?
Thanks, Amy, and thanks everyone for joining today. A lot of what I'm going to say picks up on some of the themes that Tom raised about the importance of communication, but just drills a little deeper as we think about equity and in the year 2020, when there's been so much attention to that issue nationally, how does this play out for school boards and what leadership they can show in their community? So one of the first things that's really important is to make sure that all voices are being heard. School boards, as Tom said, are in existence because they represent a community, and that community level leadership is critical. But even in smaller units of government, there is some research showing that school boards can be not always representative of the communities they serve, and that school board members sometimes listen mostly to the voices of the elites who put them there, if you will. So now is a great time for school board members to think about, how am I going to constituents in the community that I might not know already? How am I listening to communities that haven't always been at the table? And making sure that open lines of communication are there so that you can hear from different folks in the community about what their desires are and what their needs are as we go through this extraordinary time. One good piece of advice that builds on what Tom was saying that's a little hard to take right now is engaging not just when problems emerge. A lot of board members, I think, are very affirmative about getting out in front of problems. Obviously now it's the middle of a pandemic and it's too late to do some of that, at least with regards to the pandemic. But the reason that the paper is called During the Pandemic and Beyond is that as you think about life beyond the pandemic and future years, it becomes an opportunity to think, okay, who have I not had a chance to listen to and engage with, and how am I going to make sure that I'm reaching out to them? One of the things that you'll hear about as board members in talking to different parts of the community are about how resources are distributed. And there's a couple of different ways to think about this. One is, in many, if not most districts, there are multiple schools, sometimes serving different parts of a community, and thinking about how resources are distributed among those schools. A lot of that has historically been driven by teacher seniority and teacher salary, but thinking about what are we doing to make sure that all schools in a community are desirable places for the folks who live around them and go and have children going there, is something that, again, is an ever shifting set of needs, but that something that school boards should be particularly alert to in this moment. It's also the case that you can think about what are the roles that a district needs to serve in the community, and that in some parts of a school district, the needs may be different. There may be needs for more social workers or other kinds of staff. And again, a lot of those choices are ultimately going to be driven by the superintendent, but that's the kind of issue where board members can play a valuable role in hearing from the community and communicating back to the superintendent leaders. Many school districts have made a commitment to having diverse schools. And when they draw attendance boundaries, they're thinking about how do we make sure that these schools are not purely homogeneous and that different parts of the community are represented in multiple schools. That's, you know, an approach that has had some real success in different communities, but is something where it's not guaranteed to be successful. And so when you think about possibly trying to create more diverse schools, think about what are the supports that are going to be necessary for that school to succeed. Again, a lot of that will need to be implemented at the staff level, but that it may well be a board level conversation about what are those supports going to be, how do we make sure those are in our budget, and how do we as a board provide support for the staff within the community so that as schools diversify, we can make sure that they continue to be successful. And finally, again, Tom raised the important points about how you should constantly be revising your plans, and having good data and analysis is absolutely critical to that. I'm thinking about what are our metrics of success when it comes to equity. Do we have an equity dashboard? Do we have numbers that we're tracking? And how are we making sure that we have the analytic capacity to make sense of the numbers we're getting and then act on them? So again, the best of intentions don't get you all that far if you're not tracking your outcomes and making sure that you continue to take action calculated to achieve your desired outcomes. And so having clarity as a board about what are we trying to achieve, how are we measuring that, and how are we going to track our progress toward that end is something that, again, many districts are already doing, but that if you're not, now is as good a time as any to get started. So those are some ideas for boards on how to promote equity, and I will stop there.
Great. Thank you, Elliot. One quick follow-up for you as well. You and Tom, both in your discussions, highlighted, emphasized the need for engagement. Thinking about from the kind of equity lens and the challenges, are there any examples, any practices that you might call out to help make more concrete some of the things that district leaders might consider around engagement?
Yeah, absolutely. So, and this is good advice I got as someone who's not a, doesn't have experience as a district leader. Some good advice I got from district leaders who I've worked with is, to go to the leaders in your community and don't just expect them to come to you, right? That when you become a board member or when you become a principal or a superintendent, that in your area there will be religious institutions, community groups, and they are used to, in many instances, dealing with the school by going to the school building or a school board meeting when something has gone wrong. But that they all appreciate affirmative outreach. If you're a board member, go get to know the folks in your community. Ask them, what are you looking for from the school district? How do you want to engage with the school district? And again, that's something that principals and superintendents can do as well, because if you do that kind of affirmative outreach, then when issues come up and you're trying to communicate with them, you're not just that person from the school district, you're that person who came to them and who has an understanding of their space and an appreciation of their context. And that both helps make you more effective in your role and also gives people reason to connect to you at times where the pressures may make it difficult to maintain some of those good relationships. So I think that taking that affirmative step and going to people is something that, again, now you want to do that in a socially distanced way, but that's still valued, and that kind of outreach and human connection is really meaningful to people.
That's great. Thank you very much. And for our final section of the presentation, I'll hand over to my colleague, Reg Lichty.
Thanks, Amy, and thanks, Tom and Elliot. Before we turn to the Q&A, we wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about one challenging piece of this innovation puzzle, which is to say, not only how do you invest in the time and resources that are necessary to develop a great plan consistent with the equity principles that Elliot just discussed, but also the kind of ideas for getting there that Tom presented. And so the funding component, of course, is always a challenge, particularly in this moment of national crisis where we not only have extraordinary new costs, facing our school districts, but also this kind of secondary challenge created by the economic downturn, which is also placing pressure on budgets. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about, the opportunity to use some of the federal resources that Congress provided earlier this year through the CARES Act. I think most, if not all, of our listeners today are well versed in the CARES provisions, and that just over $13 billion investment specifically dedicated for K-12 schools. So I won't go into all of the details of that, but I think thinking about those resources not only as kind of a support for supplies, for some of the basic blocking and tackling of trying to, come through the pandemic intact, but to think about what investments could be made using those dollars that help in the near term get kids and families through this difficult time, but also lay the groundwork for the sort of longer term improvements and innovations that Tom and Elliot were talking about. And I think, that is, of course, things like technology and some of the connectivity challenges that Tom laid out at the beginning that have become even more apparent during this moment when almost all kids are learning from home, but also things like, innovations in how we're tracking and reporting attendance, how we're making sure that kids are coming to school and learning, what changes could be made there, including through better data systems and practices that could help address that need over time. What changes to the way we assess learners and understand what their level of knowledge and skills are so that instruction can be adjusted. I think that's a critical, idea to think about at this moment of emergency, but also one that districts and states have been exploring for long-term improvement as well. What types of innovations in community partnerships, we heard both Elliot and others on the call today, Tom and Amy, talk about the need for engagement with community stakeholders. What are the types of enrichment partnerships that can be put in place at this moment that can be part of the district strategy for long-term improvement as well? And the good news is with the CARES Act resources that Congress wanted to provide maximum flexibility to local leaders to, use those federal funds for needs that are kind of determined by school boards and school administrators. And so really any authorized federal education activity kind of meets that requirement. So it's all of the authorized activities of the Elementary and Secondary Education Acts. You could imagine the evaluation components of ESSA, the assessment components,
the technology, the professional development. You know your needs. The innovations around those needs, I think, are what you want to produce out of this collective community effort. And, these CARES Act resources are there to at least start that process. Now, I will also acknowledge that, since March, many of those funds, of course, have already been accounted for, again, kind of investing in some of that basic blocking and tackling that we were talking about. But we do anticipate, despite the struggles this fall in Washington, that eventually Congress will provide some additional emergency support. And that is likely, kind of based on what we know from conversations with leaders in Capitol Hill, to be consistent with the flexibilities that were provided for the CARES Act. So, if your district has already sort of accounted for your share of those resources, I think now is a moment to say, what could we set aside should additional resources materialize in the coming months to help us through the pandemic that we can use specifically for this planning process and then for the implementation of these innovative ideas that can really help make a difference for our students. And I mentioned ESSA, but CARES also provides for those funds to be used consistent with the Perkins Career and Technical Education Act, with IDEA. Of course, there's an incredible need for serving students with disabilities during this time. The special supplemental supports for English language learners. It's all there. You just have to be thoughtful about finding the provisions that can serve as the basis for the investments you need to make consistent with this innovation agenda. So I'll stop there, I think, and turn it back to Amy. We would love to have your questions now about what we've talked about and other things on your mind, kind of related to this moment of the pandemic, but also as you're thinking about innovation over the long term. Thanks for listening. Appreciate it.
Great. We do have a few questions that I'll begin with, and if others have questions, please type them in. I don't know if we've got anyone just by phone. Maybe there's a way to raise your hand and we can unmute you, but let me start with the ones that we have, and not specific to any of our panelists. So Tom, Elliot, Reg, feel free to jump in. A question from Michael. How do we equip school boards and district leaders to think beyond their own district boundaries in creating what is best for students?
Especially, it's a challenge, especially now given the pandemic, because there's a real focus on what are we doing in this district to help students right now. And so I think it's understandable that there's probably a pretty localized focus. But look, I think school boards, board members I've met over the years, I think understand that students move around and that we're preparing students for life, probably not necessarily where they are right now, and for success wherever that takes them. Again, I think one way to do this, and I don't mean this just sound like a plug again, but I really think it's critically important that school board members especially are engaged with colleagues through their state associations. I mean, this is where connections are made. This is where people start realizing other things that are happening around the state, around the country. If you come to a national conference, which we would encourage, because then I think it helps to kind of broaden the aperture, I guess, of the picture that people have about public education, and they start recognizing the value of looking at other alternatives.
Great. Let me go to another question then. How would you manage expectations, students, staff, parents, while returning to a reimagined school experience for students following the pandemic? So how do you manage expectations of all of the stakeholders?
Well, that's a huge question. I think part of it is there are just always going to be multiple expectations. It's probably not likely that everybody in the community is going to be of one mind. But I would just go back to some of the points we made earlier about reaching people where they are. I think Elliot made a really powerful point about not just expecting people to come to the school district. This is a conversation that has to happen where people are, and they have to know that boards are listening. When I talked earlier about a plan, for example, that the board might adopt and explaining the decisions that were made and the options that were considered and not addressed, being able to say we were out in the community, we heard this feedback, we made decisions based on it, or we took that into account, that goes a really long way to help people at least believe and feel that their views were honestly considered, even if they didn't necessarily agree with a particular outcome. We can't sell that short. That goes not only to building support for a particular decision, but I think it enhances the credibility that boards need on an ongoing basis.
Reg or Elliot, do you want to add anything to that?
I would just add, I think, Tom sort of raised this, but that this is a moment where there's no way to meet everybody's expectations, just period, right? And that part of what you have to do is, I agree with Tom, like you have to completely over communicate, explain your rationales, be ready to pivot quickly, and just accept that some number of people are not going to be happy with what you do, but that if you make the choices that are best for the community as a whole and try to hear everybody, hopefully most reasonable folks will eventually come to appreciate it, even if they're not necessarily happy in the moment.
Great. I've got a couple of questions I'll try to do kind of back-to-back, focusing explicitly on innovation. One from John, and John, personal note of welcome. Good to see you again after a long time. Are public-private partnerships one of the tools for innovation beyond the pandemic?
So let me jump in on this one first, having come to Foresight previously, having worked at a state level public-private partnership. And I would say very much yes. And part of what the benefit of public-private partnerships can be is that there are times where they can play a role that the district itself is unable to. That works best when both the district itself and the public-private partnership are really clear on what that role is and how it's complementary to what the district is doing. That having been said, I think that in this moment where, again, the needs of the communities are going to be so vast and the bandwidth of school districts is far from bottomless, thinking holistically about what is it we're trying to accomplish here as a community, what is the school board and school district's role in that, and what are some assets we have in the community that can do things we can't, where, if we do X and they do Y, that together that makes people better off. I think that kind of partnership can be incredibly valuable, but there, as with everything else, the key is communication, right? If you have a board and a public-private partnership that are working in close collaboration, that can be very effective. If you have, a board and a public-private partnership that are working at cross purposes, it's just making things worse. So I do think that that kind of capacity can be really useful, and it's just a question of being thoughtful in how it's deployed.
Great. And to follow on that, a question from Bob, a participant. We frequently think of innovation as programs, but might we also add to that innovations in measurement and accountability, site management / leadership, accountability, finance, and even governance?
Yeah, I'll jump in on that. I mean, I think, then quickly turn to you, Tom. I think those are exactly the kind of innovations that I think are most, kind of powerful in this context. I mean, if we think, for example, of the situation we had this spring where the annual assessments required by the Every Student Succeeds Act were, simply not practicable in an environment where students were not in their classrooms. And, that's a huge equity problem, to go back to kind of Elliot's part of this presentation, given the kind of loss of data associated with those missing assessments. So how can we, think about in this moment better ways to produce and use assessment, not only for accountability, but also instruction. I know Elliot, has done a lot of work in thinking about how to better incorporate the early grades into accountability systems. There are exciting ideas out there in this space that I think are ripe for discussion in this environment because of the disruption it's caused. Sorry, Tom, to cut you off there.
No, thanks, Reg. I just want to go back quickly to the public-private partnership question. I've seen some extraordinary examples of that in various districts around the country. A lot of it around career preparation and engaging communities or business in a community working with the school district. That's just one example. And I think what we've seen is there's usually a great deal of interest in partnering. The slippery slope, or the I guess the caution flag I would put out is, if I can be, I don't mean to sound too critical of anybody in the school system here, but if the mindset is, who can we engage to just fulfill our needs, we're probably missing an opportunity. Because some of the best engagements, I think, are when the schools are helping those partners achieve their goals as well. And that includes, by the way, in terms of public-public partnerships, municipalities and other public agencies that have, I think, reasons to intersect with and collaborate with school districts. So we should always be asking the question, I think, not only how can they help us, but how can we help them advance what they need to do in a way that's mutually supportive.
And if I could just add on, I think the question about innovation is a really good one. In some ways, what we've seen this fall is a huge appetite for traditional classroom instruction, right? That what families want in many instances is to have their kid back in a classroom in the way that, they have been for years and years and years. And again, whether that's the correct instinct or not, we can leave aside for the moment, but that there is an inherent traditionalism in how people view education. And so, again, one of the real opportunities in innovation is, how are we delivering the service, right? Like, well, how are we not just the classroom experience, which again, people often want a sort of traditional one, but how are we thinking differently about resource use, thinking differently about the meaning of the information we have, as Reg was saying, and that all of that has been upended by the pandemic, and that those are things where, again, if boards are willing to take a fresh look, they can both do that in their own right, and then potentially influence how states and even the federal government are doing the same.
Great. Two more questions. I think both of them, as I read them, kind of deal with mindsets. The first one from David says, wondering if any of you have had success with painting a picture of what's possible and how education can change with local boards who have communities that embrace what has been as a safety blanket. Any PD or training to open minds?
Well, this is a mindset question, right? I mean, I think Elliot just sort of touched on this a little bit, but I think some people are very comfortable with the mental image they've had of public education, the one that they knew, maybe the ones that others in their family have gone through. So in that case, the question of innovation sort of has to be accompanied with explanation. And we're not just changing for the sake of change. There's reasons we're doing it, and this is how it can help students and how it can help improve the delivery of education. Then you have others, of course, who are always pushing for that kind of innovation. Part of the role of the board, I think, and the superintendent, that leadership team that we've talked about, is really kind of is helping to pull that together and create the conversation where that can happen. But let's face it, I mean, some people are just not comfortable with change, and you can't hold back a whole system until you have everybody on board either. But the reality is, you can get, I think, a real you can get a broad agreement on direction, especially if you have the kind of engagement that we've been talking about.
I think that that's right. I mean, if people have a direction in mind, I think it's a lot easier to persuade people to take innovative approaches to achieving goals they already had than it is to persuade someone to have a completely different set of goals. And so part of what this pandemic might do, board members and district leaders don't now have a completely different set of values than they did in February, but that they may be more open than they were to thinking, oh, given the values that we have, maybe the way we achieve them has to look a little different. And so that's not quite the same as sort of being broadly open-minded about innovation, but that, I think that there have been instances where in disrupted moments like this, people are at least a little bit more open-minded about strategies and tactics toward their goals, even if those goals remain essentially what they were at the beginning.
Can I just add one other thought here, because I think it builds on what Elliot just said. When I get questions like this, my mind always goes to, I don't know, people I've met along the way, districts I've been in. And I'll just use as an example here, southwestern Pennsylvania, where I spent a lot of time when I worked at the state level. And a lot of those towns where there were steel mills that were active and a lot of businesses in place, 30 plus years ago, are not the same. And the people who live there, I think you might say would be resistant to change. And why are we doing this? Well, sometimes people have personal experiences that they inherently understand things do need to change. Some of those jobs that were really reliable for years and years and years are gone, and industry is changing, and people want their kids and their communities to be successful. And so, just to finish that story out, if you haven't been to Pittsburgh, I encourage you to go, because Pittsburgh is a great example of a city that's really reinvented itself with nanotechnology and a lot of research and a lot of great stuff happening in a way that probably wasn't even imaginable years ago. But it was because a lot of people were willing to take risks because they knew that there was a benefit directly that would be realized from it. And I think they're seeing that today.
Yeah, I think we've obviously touched on a real point of interest around changing mindsets. Some of the other questions that we've gotten focus on, how do you change a board member's mindset when they see the work differently? And how can a superintendent work with a board member that comes with an agenda? And I think you've touched on some of the strategies and thinking that would encompass those. But any other thoughts on kind of mindset? And then I think we've got time for one more question.
Well, Amy, you raised a question about how a superintendent works with a board or a certain board members who may be rowing in a different direction. I'll be polite. I will say, over the years, the vast majority of board members were there for the right reasons. They were trying hard. But there are exceptions to the rule. And I would just say, I mean, we could spend hours on this topic, but look, it's a board of directors, right? It's not 5, 7, 9 individuals that the superintendent needs to be managing. And at some level, it's up to the school board chair or the president to provide some leadership on the board as well. But look, decisions have to be made, and sometimes they're not unanimous, right? And I've often said a board is not dysfunctional if it disagrees. It's dysfunctional if it can't make a decision. And there's a big difference. So sometimes, it's going to be a divided vote, but you've got to make the vote. And the real test is whether you're able to move on from that. And that's where the energy, I think, has to be placed.
Great. And then one final question. I'm sorry if we don't get to them all. How how might boards better understand that innovation and redesign of new, right, as well as the continuous improvement of what is now are both important, right? That it isn't one or the other.
Well, I guess, again, a couple of thoughts here. One is that I really do think most people recognize the need for change, right? It's what is the change? Why do we, how's it going to be implemented? Who's it going to impact? Those are all really fair questions. But ultimately, I think people know that 5 years from now we're not going to be in the same place as a country, as a society, as an economy, and school districts sort of need to keep skating to where the puck is going to be so that they're preparing students for that success. And ultimately, I think one way to do this, and we're really critical, again, I keep pitching my former state association colleagues and NSBA and AASA and all the other associations, because these are places where people can come and they can see innovative programs, get ideas, and then see what it meant to those school systems. I've learned over the years that local school officials generally, certainly school board members as a group, I think it's fair to say, are often most impressed by what they learn from their colleagues from other places. So it's not just we need to do this, but you can see how it works and why it makes a difference. It's really important.
Elliot or Reg, anything you'd like to add on that? Or let me open it up to any final kind of parting comments as well before I wrap us up.
Yeah, I'll maybe make a final comment, and I see there's a comment in the chat about the relationship between school boards and states. Because I do think, and again, I think this goes to a really important point Tom made earlier. There are a lot of times we've seen where, and this is not just true at the school board level, that like people don't do things because they think they're prohibited and they're not, right? So part of the work here is figuring out what is possible. Taking a broad view of that, and in some instances, being prepared to ask for forgiveness rather than permission. If there are good practices that are going to be helpful in the community, figuring out a way to yes is really key, whether it's innovative or not. So I think that having that mindset of let's start by figuring out what we're trying to do here to serve our children well, and then based on that, do whatever we can to make that fit within what our powers and authorities are, is the right way to go, rather than focusing on like, what are we and are we not allowed to do? Ultimately it's about serving kids well, and a lot of the most effective boards have kept their focus there.
Reg or Tom, any other thoughts?
Not here, just a big thanks to the group for joining us today and to my fellow panelists.
I will echo that, and I wanted just to point of privilege thank Tom for partnering with Foresight Law and Policy on this work. I know when Tom decided to leave NSBA, I was really hoping he wouldn't just decide to put his feet up and check out, and and he is not. So thank you. It's great as always to spend time together and work. Thanks everyone for participating. We'll share information on the link to the video archive of this recording and to the paper on our website. Hope everyone has a great afternoon.
Thank you.